Would you trust the man who tucked you in at night if you learned he might be a murderer? On October 13th, 1935, in Maxwell Street Square, Chicago, 12-year-old Tommy Morrison stood on his crate with an afternoon edition in his hands. Ink still wet, a lie printed on the front and a truth penciled on the back. For 11 minutes he had to choose between shouting a headline that would send a mob to burn a factory or exposing a conspiracy that would destroy the only family he had left. This is a dramatized story inspired by historical events. Stay with me. I'll tell you every turn, every risk, and why one photograph came to carry a family's entire legacy. Before we start, if this kind of investigative, human-scale history matters to you, subscribe and like now to help us keep making responsibly dramatized stories that preserve lessons the past still teaches us. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from so I know where these stories land. Tommy Morrison had exactly 11 minutes to decide whether to scream the headline that would destroy his family or stay silent and watch 200 innocent people burn alive. His hand trembled as he held the afternoon edition, October 13th, 1935. The ink still wet with words that could start a riot or save lives depending on how loud he shouted them. And if you stay until the end, you will discover why this 12-year-old newsboy chose to become the most hated child in Chicago that day, and why 70 years later, his grandson keeps this photograph hidden in a drawer, too afraid to show anyone what his grandfather really did in those 11 minutes that changed everything. This photograph was discovered in 1987 inside a safety deposit box that had not been opened since 1941, wrapped in a handkerchief stained with blood that DNA testing could never identify. Chicago Historical Society Archive, unsealed documents. But look closely at Tommy's face in this image. See that smile? That is not the smile of a child selling newspapers. That is the smile of someone who knows a terrible secret. A secret that would cost him everything he loved if anyone discovered what he was really doing in that crowded square, while 200 families waited 3 blocks away, unaware that their fate depended on a 12-year-old boy with a voice loud enough to wake the dead. This is Tommy Morrison, October 13th, 1935, 12 years old, orphaned at age 9, the fastest newsboy on Maxwell Street, with a voice that could cut through factory noise and reach the 3rd-floor tenement windows, where the deaf Mrs. Kowalski would lean out to catch his headlines. Birth records, Chicago Department of Public Health, 1923. He was the only newsboy in the entire South Side who could sell out 300 papers before noon. The only kid brave enough to stand on the corner of Halsted and Maxwell, where the Irish gangs and Italian crews drew their invisible line, and both sides left him alone because even criminals needed to know what was happening in the world. But Tommy carried a burden that no child should carry. A burden that started 6 months earlier when he discovered that his dead father was not actually dead. And the man he thought was his uncle was actually the detective who had put an innocent man on death row. Because on that particular Sunday morning, one wrong word shouted to the wrong crowd meant watching the garment factory on Taylor Street burn with 200 workers locked inside, their children pressing against the wire fence, screaming for mothers who could not escape because someone had chained the emergency exits from the outside to prevent union organizers from sneaking out during breaks. Factory Safety Commission Report, 1935, sealed until 1975. And Tommy had until sunset to choose. Shout the headline that the newspaper printed, the lie that would send an angry mob to burn the factory in revenge for something that never happened, or shout the truth that he had discovered hidden in his uncle's desk drawer, the truth that would save 200 lives but destroy the only family he had left. What Tommy did not know was that someone was watching his every move that morning. Someone who had been following him for 6 months, photographing him, documenting his routine, waiting for this exact moment. And when Tommy finally understood that his uncle had not just framed one innocent man, but had built his entire career on lies that sent 17 people to their deaths, he realized it was not just 200 factory workers in danger. It was his 8-year-old sister, Mary, waiting for him at the orphanage. Unaware that the nice detective who visited her every Sunday and brought her candy was the same man who had murdered their father 4 years ago and made it look like an accident. But to understand how a 12-year-old newsboy ended up holding the fate of 200 people in his ink-stained hands, we need to go back 6 months before this photograph. To the day Tommy still believed in heroes, still thought his Uncle Patrick was the greatest detective in Chicago, still had no idea that the man who tucked him in at night was the same man who had beaten his father to death in an alley behind the stockyards and paid a coroner to write heart failure on the death certificate. Spring 1935. Chicago's South Side was a place where mothers tied bells to their children's ankles so they could hear them coming home through the smoke that poured from 1,000 factory chimneys, where men worked 16-hour shifts for wages that could not feed a family, where children like Tommy learned to read by studying newspaper headlines they shouted 40 times a day until the words burned into their memory, whether they understood them or not. Oral histories collected from Southside residents. 1975 and 1980, DePaul University. There was an unwritten law in neighborhoods like Maxwell Street. You kept your head down, you minded your business, and if you saw something that could get someone killed, you pretended you saw nothing at all. Because informants disappeared, witnesses forgot, and children who asked too many questions ended up in the Chicago River with pockets full of stones. But Tommy had always been different. Ever since he was 7 years old, he noticed things other children missed. Like how his father would come home with bruises he claimed were from the stockyards, but always on his ribs where a billy club would strike, never on his hands where factory work would mark him. How his mother would count the money in the coffee tin 3 times every night as if hoping the numbers would somehow change. And how his Uncle Patrick, the famous detective, would visit every Sunday with gifts they could not afford, speaking in whispers with his father in the kitchen while Tommy pressed his ear against the door and heard words like evidence and testimony, and they will kill you if you talk. Discovered in Tommy's childhood diary, found in 1989. When Tommy's father died in March 1931, the official report said, heart failure. James Morrison, age 34, collapsed in an alley, dead before the ambulance arrived. But Tommy remembered the funeral, how his father's face was swollen on one side, how Uncle Patrick cried harder than anyone and promised to take care of Tommy and Mary forever, how the other stockyard workers stood in the back of the church and would not meet his mother's eyes. He remembered his mother died exactly 6 months later. The doctor said, grief. But Tommy found the empty bottle of sleeping pills she had hidden under her mattress, and the note she had started writing but never finished, that said Patrick knows what James was going to. Uncle Patrick became their guardian. He moved Tommy and Mary into his apartment on Ashland Avenue, enrolled them in school, visited Mary at the orphanage every week after she got sick with tuberculosis and needed constant care. He was everything an uncle should be, kind, generous, protective. He taught Tommy how to sell newspapers, how to project his voice, how to read people's faces and know which headline would make them buy. He paid for Mary's medicine. He told Tommy stories about catching criminals and making the city safe. And Tommy loved him desperately, because Uncle Patrick was all they had left. Until April 15th, 1935, the day that changed everything. Tommy had come home early from his newspaper route because it was raining, his paper soaked and unsellable. Uncle Patrick was at the precinct. The apartment was empty, and Tommy, looking for a towel in his uncle's room, accidentally knocked over a stack of files that spilled across the floor. Police files, cases, photographs. And there, in a folder marked confidential, he found his father's real death certificate. The one that said blunt force trauma to the skull, multiple injuries consistent with sustained beating, and a note in Uncle Patrick's handwriting. Witness eliminated. Case closed. Informant problem solved. Tommy's hand shook as he read file after file. 17 cases. 17 people Uncle Patrick had investigated. 17 people sent to prison or executed. 17 files with notes about evidence that disappeared. Witnesses who changed their stories, confessions obtained through methods not described. And in every single file, a name circled in red. Factory Workers Union, Local 240. The same union his father had belonged to. The same union that had been trying to expose safety violations at the garment factories. The same union whose leaders kept disappearing one by one until there was no one left to fight. Tommy understood then what his father had been. Not just a stockyard worker, an informant. Someone gathering evidence about factory owners who bribed police to ignore safety violations. Someone who trusted his brother-in-law to protect him. Someone who died because Uncle Patrick was not a hero at all, but a man who had sold his soul to the factory owners who paid him more in a month than an honest cop made in a year. And now, 6 months later, October 13th, 1935, Tommy stood in Maxwell Street Square with a newspaper in his hands and a choice that would define the rest of his life. Because the headline was a lie. It screamed, "Union organizer murders factory owner's daughter." And below it, "Angry citizens march on Taylor Street." The story claimed that Joseph Kozlov, a union leader, had kidnapped and killed the factory owner's 13-year-old daughter in revenge for being fired. It gave the address of the garment factory where Kozlov supposedly worked. It called for justice. But Tommy had seen the real police report in his uncle's desk 3 days ago. The factory owner's daughter was not dead. She had run away to Michigan with a boy her father disapproved of. Uncle Patrick had found her, brought her back, and was keeping her hidden until he could stage a murder that would destroy the union forever and give the factory owners an excuse to crack down on workers who demanded fire exits and fair wages. 200 people worked in that factory, most of them women. Immigrant women who could barely speak English. Women who worked locked inside because the owners feared they would steal fabric. Women whose children waited outside the gates every evening at 6 o'clock to walk their mothers home. And if Tommy shouted this headline the way every newsboy was instructed to shout it, the crowd gathering in the square would march on that factory. They would burn it, and 200 people would die because the emergency exits were chained shut, and Uncle Patrick had made sure the fire department would be delayed responding to a false alarm on the opposite side of town. Tommy had 11 minutes to decide. Shout the lie and save himself and Mary. Or shout the truth he had written on the back of the newspaper in pencil, the real story about where the factory owner's daughter actually was, and watch Uncle Patrick destroy him. And that is when the photographer appeared. A man Tommy had never seen before, setting up a camera on a tripod, pointing it directly at Tommy, waiting. Just waiting. As if he knew something was about to happen that needed to be documented. As if this moment, this choice, was somehow more important than one boy's life or death. Tommy had 2 options. Shout the headline exactly as printed and watch 200 women burn alive, or flip the paper over and shout the truth he had penciled on the back about where the factory owner's daughter really was, and condemn himself and Mary to whatever revenge Uncle Patrick would design. With his heart hammering against his ribs, and exactly 9 minutes before the crowd would surge toward Taylor Street, he made the choice that would either save him or destroy him. Survivor testimonies collected in 1985 describe similar moral paralysis during crisis moments. He decided to trust the photographer. It was an insane gamble. Tommy did not know this man, had never seen him before yesterday when he first noticed the camera following him through his newspaper route. But something in the way the photographer positioned himself, always keeping Tommy in frame, always focused not on the crowd, but on Tommy's face, suggested this man was documenting something specific, something important. And Tommy had learned from 3 years of selling newspapers that you could read a person's intention in their eyes. This man's eyes held no malice, only an intense focus that felt almost protective. Tommy walked directly toward the photographer, weaving through the crowd of men gathering in the square, factory workers getting off the early shift, young men angry and unemployed, the kind of crowd that could become a mob with the right spark. He stopped 3 feet from the camera and held up the newspaper so the photographer could see both sides. The printed lie on the front, the penciled truth on the back. And he mouthed 2 words. Which one? The photographer lowered his camera, looked Tommy directly in the eyes, and said in a voice that carried a faint German accent, "Your father would want you to shout the truth." Then he raised the camera again and said, "I have been photographing your uncle's crimes for 2 years. I have evidence. But I need you to be brave for 11 more minutes. Can you do that?" Tommy's throat closed. This stranger knew about his father, knew about Uncle Patrick, had been watching, documenting, gathering evidence, which meant Tommy was not alone, which meant there might be a way to save both the factory workers and Mary. But it also meant the next 11 minutes would determine whether he lived to see his 13th birthday. Tommy climbed onto the wooden crate he used as his platform, the same crate he stood on every day to sell papers. The crowd was growing, maybe 60 men now, all of them angry, all of them looking for a target for their rage. In 1935, Chicago was a city where men had lost everything, their jobs, their dignity, their hope. They had watched their children go hungry, had stood in bread lines, had seen factory owners get rich while workers died from preventable accidents. Economic data from Chicago Department of Labor, 1935. And when a newspaper told them that a union organizer had murdered a child, they did not question it. They just needed someone to burn. Tommy opened his mouth. His voice, the voice that could reach 3 blocks away, the voice that Uncle Patrick had trained to cut through noise and chaos, came out strong and clear. Extra, read all about it. But the words that followed were not the words printed on the page. They were his words. Factory owner's daughter found alive in Michigan. Ran away with boyfriend. Police confirm no murder. Union leader Joseph Kozlov innocent of all charges. The crowd went silent, confused. Because every other newsboy in Chicago was shouting the opposite story. Murder, revenge, justice. And here was this kid on Maxwell Street shouting something completely different. Tommy saw Mr. Kowalski, who ran the butcher shop, frown and move closer. Saw the Irish factory workers from Bridgeport exchange glances. Saw the moment when confusion began to shift toward anger. A man in the front shouted, "That is not what the paper says, kid. Show us the headline." Tommy's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the newspaper straight. But he held it up, showing the printed headline. And then, in a move he had not planned, he flipped it over and showed the penciled truth on the back. And he said, "This is what my uncle Detective Patrick Morrison does not want you to know. He is hiding the factory owner's daughter to frame Joseph Kozlov. If you march on that factory, 200 women die. The emergency exits are chained. This is a setup." The crowd erupted, half of them surging forward to grab Tommy, the other half shouting questions. And Tommy saw through the chaos that Uncle Patrick had just turned the corner onto Maxwell Street, 50 yards away, his face already shifting from confusion to rage as he realized what his nephew was doing. This was the moment. The point of no return. Tommy jumped off the crate and ran, not away from the crowd, but toward Taylor Street, toward the factory. Because if he could get there first, if he could warn the workers, maybe they could break down the chained exits before the mob arrived. Maybe he could save them, even if he could not save himself. He heard Uncle Patrick shouting his name, heard the crowd splitting, some following Tommy, others surrounding the photographer who was still calmly taking pictures as if documenting a historical event, rather than witnessing a child sign his own death warrant. Tommy's legs pumped. His newsboy bag flapped against his hip. And he thought about Mary, 8 years old, waiting for him at St. Vincent's orphanage, expecting him to visit on Sunday with the candy he always brought her. He thought about his father, dying in an alley, betrayed by the man who was supposed to be family. He thought about his mother taking those pills, unable to live with what she knew. And he thought, if I die today, at least I die like they did, trying to do the right thing. Tommy reached the factory at exactly 3:47 p.m. The afternoon shift was still working. Through the barred windows on the 3rd floor, he could see women bent over sewing machines. Their children waited outside the gates as they did every day, some of them younger than Tommy, some of them holding babies on their hips. Tommy started screaming, "Fire! Get out!" They chained the exits. You have to break down the doors. The children stared at him like he was crazy. But Mrs. Kaminsky, who waited for her mother every day, understood immediately. She had lived through a factory fire in New York when she was little, had seen what happened when exits were locked. She started screaming too, and then all the children were screaming. And inside the factory, the women heard. The sound of 200 women realizing they were trapped, realizing someone had chained them inside like animals, was something Tommy would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. It was a sound that started as confusion and rose to terror, and then transformed into rage. The kind of rage that gives a 100-pound woman the strength to pick up a sewing machine and throw it through a window. Glass shattered. Women started jumping from the 1st floor, a 10-foot drop onto cobblestones, breaking ankles and wrists but getting out. Others attacked the chained doors from the inside with anything they could use as weapons. Chair legs, scissors, industrial thread spools. The chains began to give. And that is when Uncle Patrick reached the factory gate with 30 men from Maxwell Street behind him. He grabbed Tommy by the collar and lifted him off the ground. Tommy saw the murder in his uncle's eyes, the same look his father must have seen in that alley 4 years ago. Uncle Patrick's hand moved to his belt where he kept his revolver, and he said in a voice that was almost sad, "You stupid boy, you have no idea what you have done." But then the photographer was there, camera raised, and he said, "I have photographs of you accepting bribes from factory owners. I have recordings of you threatening witnesses. I have your handwritten notes about eliminating informants. And as of 3 minutes ago, I have federal agents surrounding this location because I work for the Department of Labor, and we have been building a case against you for 2 years." Uncle Patrick's grip loosened. Tommy dropped to the ground. And behind them, 200 women poured out of the factory exits they had broken open themselves, grabbing their children, running before anyone could stop them. The mob from Maxwell Street, seeing the women escape, seeing federal agents approaching, began to disperse. And Uncle Patrick, understanding that his entire carefully constructed life had just collapsed, did something Tommy never expected. He smiled, looked at Tommy, and said, "Your father would be proud." Then he ran. They caught him 3 blocks away. But in those 3 blocks, Uncle Patrick managed to throw away a small leather notebook that Tommy found 2 days later. It contained names, dates, payments, and 17 confessions written in Uncle Patrick's handwriting, describing in detail how he had framed 17 innocent people and murdered 3 witnesses, including James Morrison. It was everything the federal agents needed to not only convict Patrick but to free the prisoners who had been wrongly convicted. But the moment that mattered, the moment that the photographer captured, was this. Tommy Morrison, 12 years old, standing in Maxwell Street Square, holding a newspaper with the truth written in pencil on the back, his voice raised to save 200 lives, his face showing not fear but determination. The photograph shows the exact second before he shouted the words that would change everything. You can see the crowd behind him. You can see the confusion on their faces. And if you look closely at Tommy's eyes, you can see something that no child should have. The absolute certainty that he is about to sacrifice himself for strangers. 3:47 p.m., October 13th, 1935. Tommy stood on that wooden crate with 78 people staring at him, waiting for him to shout the headline that would send them marching toward murder. And he thought about Mary. She would be having dinner at St. Vincent's right now. The watery soup and stale bread they served every Sunday. She would be wondering if Tommy would visit today, or if he was too busy with his newspaper route. She would not know that in the next 5 minutes, her brother would either save 200 lives or become just another child who disappeared in Chicago. One more name in a city that swallowed people whole and never bothered to explain where they went. Tommy's throat was dry. The newspaper in his hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He could see Uncle Patrick now, pushing through the crowd on Maxwell Street, his detective's badge catching the sunlight, his face already showing that he understood what was about to happen. Tommy had maybe 30 seconds before his uncle reached him. 30 seconds to make a choice. 30 seconds to decide what kind of man he was going to become. He looked at the photographer one more time. The man nodded. Just a slight movement of his head, but it was enough. Tommy filled his lungs with air that tasted like coal smoke and horse manure and desperation, and he shouted, "Extra, extra! Factory owner's daughter found alive in Michigan. Union leader innocent. Detective Morrison covering up false charges." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The crowd surged forward. Hands grabbed at Tommy, trying to pull him down, trying to shut him up. But Tommy kept shouting, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The exits are chained. 200 women trapped inside. This is murder, not justice. Do not march. Do not burn. They want you to kill innocent people." Mr. Kowalski reached him first, grabbed the newspaper from his hands, read the penciled words on the back, and then did something that saved Tommy's life. He turned to the crowd and said, "The kid is telling the truth. I know Yosef Kozlov. He would not hurt anyone. Someone is using us. Someone wants those factory workers dead." The crowd split, half of them running toward Taylor Street to warn the workers, the other half surrounding Uncle Patrick, who had finally reached Tommy. The photographer kept taking pictures. Click, click, click. Each photograph documenting what happened when one child told the truth in a city built on lies. The complete series of photographs, 16 total, were admitted as evidence in United States v. Morrison, 1936. Tommy locked eyes with his uncle, and in that moment, he saw something he had never seen before. Not anger, not rage, but respect. Uncle Patrick looked at his nephew, this 12-year-old boy who had just destroyed everything Patrick had spent 15 years building, and he smiled. It was a sad smile, the smile of a man who knows he has been beaten. And he said, loud enough that everyone could hear, "The boy is right. The daughter is alive. I have been taking money from factory owners to eliminate union leadership. James Morrison was going to expose us, so I killed him." The confession shocked everyone into silence. Even the photographer lowered his camera for a moment, as if unable to believe what he was hearing. But Tommy understood. Uncle Patrick was not confessing because he felt guilty. He was confessing to protect something, to protect someone. And Tommy realized with horror who that someone was. Mary. Uncle Patrick said, "I did it all to pay for Mary's medicine. Tuberculosis treatment costs more than an honest cop makes in 10 years. Every bribe I took, every case I fixed, every person I framed, it was to keep that little girl alive. James was going to destroy everything. So I stopped him, and I would do it again." It was a brilliant move. Uncle Patrick was not trying to escape. He was trying to make himself a tragic figure, a man who did terrible things for understandable reasons, a man who could maybe negotiate a lighter sentence. But more importantly, he was trying to make Tommy carry guilt, trying to make him believe that if Mary died because they could no longer afford her medicine, it would be Tommy's fault for exposing the truth. Tommy felt the weight of it crushing down on him. All those people Uncle Patrick had framed and murdered, all the families destroyed, and the money had gone to save Mary, his sister, the only family he had left. And now, by telling the truth, Tommy had just sentenced her to death as surely as if he had held a pillow over her face. The federal agents arrived. They handcuffed Uncle Patrick. They took statements. They praised Tommy as a hero. But all Tommy could think about was Mary in her bed at St. Vincent's, her lungs barely working, her medication running out, no one left to pay for the treatment that kept her alive. The photographer, whose name was Heinrich Müller, found Tommy sitting on the curb 2 hours later. He sat down next to him and said, "Your uncle was lying. I have been investigating his finances for 2 years. He was not spending money on your sister's medicine. He was spending it on a house in Miami and a woman named Dolores who thinks he is a wealthy businessman. The orphanage has been providing Mary's medicine for free through a charity program. She was never in danger. He used her as an excuse to justify his crimes, and now he is using her as a weapon to make you feel guilty. Do not let him win." Tommy could not speak, could not process. Heinrich pulled out a folder and showed Tommy bank statements, love letters to Dolores, photographs of Uncle Patrick in Miami wearing expensive suits and smoking cigars. Everything was a lie. Even the one thing Tommy thought was true, that Uncle Patrick loved Mary enough to become a monster for her, was just another manipulation. Heinrich said, "I have been documenting corruption in Chicago's police force and factory system for 3 years. Your uncle was the worst of them. He destroyed 17 lives for money. Your father was a brave man who was trying to expose safety violations that killed workers every month. Patrick murdered him to protect his income stream. You did not betray your family today. You honored them. And I will make sure everyone knows it." The photograph Heinrich took at that moment shows Tommy's face in profile, tears cutting clean lines through the newsprint ink that always stained his cheeks. His expression showing the exact moment when a child realizes the adult he trusted most was his greatest enemy. It is not a beautiful photograph. It is a devastating one. And when it was published in the Chicago Tribune 3 days later, it became the image that defined the factory corruption scandal and led to federal reforms that saved thousands of lives over the next decade. But in that moment, Tommy did not care about reforms or scandals or saving anyone. He only cared about getting to Mary. He ran the entire 2 miles to St. Vincent's orphanage, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air. He found her in the common room, playing with a rag doll, looking healthier than he had seen her in months. She looked up and smiled and said, "Tommy, you are early. Did you bring candy?" And Tommy hugged her so hard she squealed, and then he told her everything. About their father, about Uncle Patrick, about the 200 women, about the choice he had made. He told her because she deserved to know the truth, because he was done with lies, because even an 8-year-old girl had the right to understand who her family really was. Mary listened to everything, and when Tommy finished, she said, "Mama told me before she died. She made me promise not to tell you because she wanted you to love Uncle Patrick. She wanted one of us to have a father figure. But I always knew. I saw his hands after he came back the night Daddy died. He had blood on his knuckles. I was only 4, but I remember. They held each other in that orphanage common room and cried for parents who died, trying to do the right thing, for an uncle who was never really their uncle, for the family they would never have. And they made a promise. They would survive. They would take care of each other. And they would never let anyone make them choose between truth and safety again. In the 10 minutes after Tommy exposed Uncle Patrick, while federal agents swarmed Maxwell Street and factory workers poured out of the building with their children, something happened that no one had planned for. Mrs. Kaminsky, the woman whose daughter had screamed fire and warned the others, found Tommy sitting against the factory wall trying to catch his breath. She knelt down, looked at this 12-year-old newsboy who had just saved her life, and she said, "My family has nothing. We live in one room and share a bathroom with 4 other families. But we are alive because of you. So I'm going to tell you something that will save your life." She leaned in close and whispered, "Your uncle has a partner. Someone higher up who gave the orders. Someone who will come for you. His name is written in a ledger Patrick keeps in his desk at the station. You need to find it before that person finds you." Tommy did not want to believe her. Did not want to imagine that there was someone even worse than Uncle Patrick. But Mrs. Kaminsky's eyes held no doubt. She had lived through too much to waste words on lies. So that night, while Chicago's newspapers scrambled to rewrite the story, while federal agents interrogated Uncle Patrick, Tommy broke into the police station, with Heinrich's help, though neither of them would ever admit it, and found the ledger. It was exactly where Mrs. Kaminsky said it would be. Leather-bound. Locked. Tommy broke the lock with a screwdriver, and inside, page after page of payments, names, dates, and at the top of the first page, in Uncle Patrick's careful handwriting, payments received from J. Harrington, Factory Owners Association President, and below that, a list of 17 names. 17 union organizers and factory workers who had been eliminated on Harrington's orders. But the detail that made Tommy's blood run cold was on the last page, a payment schedule that extended into 1936. And next to the final payment, a note. Final assignment. Morrison children. Make it look accidental. Collect payment when both are eliminated. Uncle Patrick had been planning to kill them. Tommy and Mary were supposed to be his last job before he retired to Miami with Dolores and his blood money. The visits to Mary at the orphanage were not love. They were surveillance, making sure she stayed in one predictable place. And Tommy's newspaper route, the one Uncle Patrick had helped him establish, took him past 4 different locations where a child could disappear without witnesses. Tommy stood in that police station, holding evidence that proved his uncle had planned to murder them, and he made a decision. He was not going to run. He was not going to hide. He was going to finish what his father started. He copied every page of that ledger by hand, spending 6 hours in the station, hiding every time he heard footsteps. Then he returned the original to Uncle Patrick's desk, exactly where he found it. And the next morning, he gave the copies to Heinrich, who gave them to federal investigators, who used them to arrest J. Harrington and dismantle the entire corruption network that had controlled Chicago's factories for 15 years. The trial lasted 3 months. Uncle Patrick was convicted of 3 murders and 17 counts of evidence tampering. He was sentenced to life in prison. J. Harrington received 25 years. 6 other police officers and 4 factory owners were convicted on related charges. United States versus Morrison et al., detailed in Chicago Tribune archives, January through March 1936. And the testimony that secured every conviction came from a 12-year-old newsboy who stood in a courtroom and told the truth, even though the defense attorneys tried to destroy his character, and his uncle stared at him from the defendant's table with eyes that promised revenge. But the plot twist that no one saw coming happened 3 weeks after the convictions. Heinrich Müller, the photographer who had documented everything, revealed something to Tommy that changed his understanding of the entire story. They were sitting in Heinrich's small office, going through photographs, when Heinrich said, "I need to tell you who I really am. My name is not Heinrich Müller. It is Heinrich Morrison. I am your father's younger brother. Your real uncle. I left Chicago 20 years ago to work for the Department of Labor. James contacted me 6 months before Patrick killed him. He told me everything, asked me to watch over you if anything happened. I could not stop Patrick from murdering him, but I could make sure his death meant something. So I spent 2 years building a case, waiting for the right moment. And you gave me that moment when you chose to tell the truth. Tommy could not speak. His father had another brother, a good brother, a brother who had been protecting them from the shadows. Heinrich showed him letters James had written, describing Tommy's quick mind, his loud voice, his stubborn insistence on fairness even as a child. Letters that proved James had known his life was in danger and had been preparing Tommy without Tommy realizing it. Every story about honesty, every lesson about standing up for what was right. It had all been James Morrison preparing his son for the day he would have to face impossible choices. Heinrich said, "Your father saved my life when we were children. I was drowning in the Chicago River. He jumped in even though he could barely swim, nearly died getting me to shore. I told him I owed him everything. He said the only way I could repay him was to live a life worth saving. So I did. I became someone who fights for workers' rights, who documents injustice, who makes sure the truth gets told even when powerful people want it buried. And when he called me for help, I came. But I was too late to save him. I was not too late to save you." Tommy moved in with Heinrich after the trial. Mary got stronger with proper medical care. And 30 years later, when Tommy was 42 and Mary was 38, they found the photograph Heinrich had taken that day in Maxwell Street Square. It was in a box in Heinrich's attic, mixed with hundreds of other photographs from his investigative career. Tommy held it and remembered everything. The fear, the choice, the moment when he decided that 200 lives mattered more than his safety. Tommy had become a labor lawyer. He had spent 30 years fighting for workers' rights, arguing cases that established protections for factory workers, ensuring that emergency exits could never be chained again. Mary had become a doctor specializing in tuberculosis treatment. She had saved hundreds of children who would have died like she nearly did. And they had both raised families and told their children about James Morrison, the stockyard worker who died, trying to make the world safer for people like them. But it was Tommy's grandson, Michael, who asked the question that mattered most when Tommy showed him the photograph on his 80th birthday in 2003. "Grandpa, did you ever regret it? Telling the truth when you could have stayed silent?" And Tommy said, "Every single day. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that a 12-year-old child had to make that choice. I regret that my father died, and my mother died, and Uncle Patrick became a monster. But I do not regret telling the truth, because 200 women went home to their children that night, and 17 innocent people got released from prison, and thousands of workers gained protections that saved their lives. My father taught me that the truth is the only thing that matters when everything else is stripped away. The truth is the only foundation you can build a life on. Everything else is sand." Tommy Morrison died in 2008 at age 85. Mary Morrison died in 2012 at age 85. And the photograph Heinrich took that day in Maxwell Street Square, the photograph that captured the exact moment when a child chose courage over safety, still sits in Michael's desk drawer in Seattle. He has not shown it to anyone. Not because he is ashamed, but because it feels too sacred, too personal, too much like a relic of something that should be remembered privately rather than displayed publicly. But sometimes, late at night, Michael takes out the photograph and looks at his grandfather's face. And he thinks about the moments in his own life when he faced choices between truth and convenience, between doing what was right and doing what was safe. And he remembers what Tommy told him before he died. The hardest part about telling the truth is not the danger. It is living with the knowledge that you could have chosen differently, that you could have stayed silent and safe and let someone else pay the price. But once you choose truth, once you decide that other people's lives matter as much as your own comfort, you cannot go back. You become someone different. And that person, the person who tells the truth, even when it costs everything, that person can sleep at night. That person can look their children in the eyes. That person can die knowing they lived as a human being instead of surviving as a coward. Michael keeps the photograph in his desk drawer, wrapped in the same handkerchief that Tommy used to wipe newsprint ink from his hands after every shift, the cloth still stained with the black smudges that marked every newsboy in Chicago. Next to it, he keeps the pencil Tommy used to write the truth on the back of that newspaper. The pencil is worn down to almost nothing, but Michael has never sharpened it. It sits there as a reminder that the smallest tools can change the world if someone is brave enough to use them. Sometimes Michael's daughter, Emma, who is 9 years old now, asks about the photograph. She has seen him looking at it late at night when he thinks no one is watching. She has asked why the boy in the picture looks so scared and so determined at the same time. And Michael tells her the story, the same way Tommy told him, the same way James told Tommy through his actions, if not his words. He tells her about courage that does not feel like courage, about choices that feel impossible, but turn out to be the only choices that matter, about children who were forced to become heroes because the adults around them had failed. And Emma listens with eyes that remind Michael of Tommy's eyes in the photograph, dark, serious, already understanding more than a child should have to understand about how the world works and how rarely it works fairly. She asks the question that Michael knew she would eventually ask. Would you do what Grandpa Tommy did? Would you save people even if it meant you might die? Michael does not answer immediately. He looks at the photograph, at his grandfather's face frozen in that moment of decision, and he says, I hope I would. I hope I have been raised right enough, loved enough, taught enough about what matters that if I ever face that choice, I will make the decision your great-great-grandfather Tommy made. But the truth is, you never know until the moment arrives. You never know if you are brave until bravery is required. All you can do is live your life in a way that prepares you for that moment. Practice telling the truth when it is easy so that you can tell it when it is hard. Stand up for what is right in small ways so that you can stand up for it in big ways. And remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to act despite the fear because something matters more than your safety. That is the lesson Tommy Morrison left behind. Not just in the photograph, not just in the legal reforms his testimony helped create, not just in the 200 women who lived because he told the truth, but in the way he lived every day after that moment. Tommy never stopped being a newsboy at heart. He never stopped believing that information mattered, that truth mattered, that ordinary people deserved to know what powerful people were trying to hide. He spent his entire legal career representing workers who had no money and no power against corporations who had both. He lost more cases than he won. But every case he took, every worker he represented, every time he stood in a courtroom and demanded accountability, he was that 12-year-old boy again, standing on a wooden crate, shouting the truth, even though it terrified him. Mary carried the lesson differently. She became a doctor because she understood what it meant to be powerless, to be sick, to depend on the kindness of strangers and the courage of a brother who loved her enough to risk everything. She treated patients who could not pay. She opened a clinic in the south side of Chicago that served immigrant families and factory workers, the same community that her father had tried to protect. She never forgot that her life was bought with her brother's courage and her father's sacrifice, and she spent every day trying to be worthy of that price. Heinrich Morrison, the real uncle, the photographer who documented everything, never stopped working. He spent 40 years with the Department of Labor, investigating corruption, documenting abuse, building cases that dismantled systems of exploitation. The photographs he took that day in Maxwell Street became part of the evidence that led to the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and dozens of other reforms that protected millions of workers. But he never took credit, never claimed glory. He told people that the real hero was a 12-year-old newsboy who understood something most adults never learn, that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, but complicity. Uncle Patrick Morrison died in prison in 1954 at age 57. He never showed remorse, never admitted that what he did was wrong. In his final letter to Tommy, written 3 days before he died of a heart attack, he wrote, "You destroyed everything I built. You took away my future, my freedom, my life. But I want you to know that I am proud of you. Not because you were right, but because you were strong. I raised you to survive in a world that crushes weak people. And you survived. You beat me. That takes a kind of strength I did not think you had. Your father had it too. I hated him for it. But I respected it. Die knowing you were stronger than me. That is the only gift I have left to give you." Tommy never responded to the letter. He kept it, but he never read it again after the first time. Because he understood that Uncle Patrick's pride was not a gift, but a final manipulation. An attempt to frame his crimes as some kind of twisted lesson in strength. Tommy knew better. What happened in Maxwell Street Square was not about strength. It was about love. Love for strangers he would never meet. Love for a father he barely remembered. Love for a sister he would die to protect. Love for a truth that mattered more than his life. And that is the story Michael tells his daughter Emma when she asks about the photograph. He tells her that courage is not strength. It is love. It is caring about something more than you care about your own safety. It is believing that the world can be better and that your actions matter, even when they feel small and powerless. He tells her that her great-great-grandfather Tommy was not a hero because he was brave. He was a hero because he loved people he had never met enough to risk everything for them. Emma holds the photograph carefully, her small fingers tracing the outline of Tommy's face. She says, "He looks like you, Daddy," around the eyes. And Michael realizes she is right. Genetics have passed down more than physical features. They have passed down a way of seeing the world. A belief that truth matters. That justice matters. That ordinary people have the power to change extraordinary things if they are willing to pay the price. Michael puts the photograph back in the desk drawer, wraps it carefully in the newsprint-stained handkerchief, places the worn-down pencil beside it. And he thinks about the chain of courage that connects him to a 12-year-old newsboy in 1935 Chicago. How James Morrison jumped into a river to save his brother Heinrich. How Heinrich spent years building a case to honor his brother's memory. How Tommy chose truth over safety. How Mary chose healing over bitterness. How each generation carried forward a legacy of believing that individuals matter, that choices matter, that the small acts of courage we perform ripple forward through time in ways we cannot predict or measure. The photograph stays in the drawer, not hidden, but protected, kept safe for the next generation. For the moment when Emma or her children or her grandchildren face their own impossible choice and need to remember that they come from people who chose right over easy, who chose others over themselves, who chose truth even when truth was dangerous. That is the real story behind the photograph, not just what happened on October 13, 1935. But what happens every day when someone remembers that moment and decides to live worthy of the sacrifice it represents. The photograph is not an ending. It is a beginning. A reminder that every generation faces its own Maxwell Street moment. Its own choice between silence and speech. Its own opportunity to be the person who tells the truth when truth matters most. And somewhere in that photograph, frozen forever at age 12, Tommy Morrison is still standing on that wooden crate, still holding that newspaper, still choosing courage, still showing us what it means to be human in a world that tries to make us less than human, still teaching us that the most powerful thing any of us can do is care enough about strangers to risk everything for them. That is the lesson. That is the legacy. That is why Michael keeps the photograph in his desk drawer instead of in a museum. Because some truths are too important to be displayed. They need to be lived. They need to be passed down through whispered stories and careful hands. They need to be protected not by glass cases and museum lighting, but by families who remember what their ancestors did and why it mattered. Tommy Morrison was 12 years old when he changed the world. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a terrified child making an impossible choice. But he made it anyway. And 80 years later, his descendants still feel the weight of that choice, still carry the responsibility of being people who come from courage, still understand that the photograph in the drawer is not just a historical artifact, but a challenge. The challenge is simple. When your moment comes, when you stand on your own wooden crate holding your own truth that could save lives or cost everything, what will you choose? Will you be silent and safe? Or will you shout the truth even though your hands are shaking and your voice is breaking and everything inside you is screaming to run away? Tommy Morrison chose to shout, and 200 women went home to their children, and 17 innocent people walked out of prison. And thousands of workers gained protections that saved their lives. And a 12-year-old newsboy became the kind of man who could look his grandson in the eyes 80 years later and say without hesitation, "I told the truth, and I would do it again." That is what the photograph captures. Not just a moment, but a decision. Not just a child, but a choice. Not just history, but a lesson that echoes forward through time, waiting for the next person who needs to remember that courage is possible, that truth matters, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when love is stronger than fear. The photograph stays in the drawer, safe, protected, waiting, ready for the next generation that will need to remember what Tommy Morrison knew at age 12, that the hardest and most important thing any of us will ever do is choose truth when lies are easier, choose courage when fear is safer, choose love when indifference is more comfortable, and that when we make that choice, we become part of something bigger than ourselves. We become part of a story that started long before we were born and will continue long after we die. We become proof that humanity is not defined by our worst moments, but by our best choices. We become the answer to the question that every generation must ask. When everything is on the line, who will we choose to be? Tommy Morrison answered that question on October 13, 1935. And his answer echoes still in the hearts of everyone who knows his story, everyone who sees his photograph, everyone who faces their own moment of truth and remembers that a 12-year-old newsboy once stood on a wooden crate in Maxwell Street Square and chose to save strangers instead of himself. That is the story behind the photograph. That is the truth worth shouting. That is the legacy worth protecting. And that is why Michael keeps it in his desk drawer, wrapped in a newsprint-stained handkerchief, next to a worn-down pencil that once wrote truth on the back of lies. Because some stories are too sacred for museums. They belong to families. They belong to children who need to know that courage is real. They belong to all of us who hope that when our moment comes, we will be brave enough to do what Tommy Morrison did. Tell the truth, even when everything depends on staying silent. The years pass. Emma grows up hearing the story so many times she can recite it by heart. But it is not until she turns 12, the same age Tommy was in the photograph, that she truly understands what it means. She is sitting in her middle school cafeteria when she sees 3 older boys surrounding a smaller kid, an immigrant boy from Somalia who barely speaks English. They are taking his lunch money. Everyone sees it happening. Teachers walk past. Other students look away. And Emma feels something shift inside her chest. She stands up, walks over to the boys, says in a voice that surprises her with its steadiness, "Give him his money back." The boys laugh. One of them says, "What are you going to do about it?" And Emma says, "I am going to tell everyone what you are doing. I'm going to make sure everyone knows." And she pulls out her phone and starts recording. The boys scatter. The Somali kid gets his money back. Emma gets called to the principal's office for using her phone during lunch, but she does not care. Because that night, when she tells her father what happened, Michael opens his desk drawer and shows her the photograph again. And this time, Emma sees something different. She sees herself. She sees that Tommy Morrison's courage was not some mythical quality reserved for heroes in history books. It was a choice available to anyone willing to make it. A choice she had just made in a cafeteria over $5 and a kid she barely knew. Michael says, "This is what the photograph means. It means every generation gets their turn. Every person gets their moment. And what you did today, standing up when everyone else looked away, that is the same thing your great-great-grandfather did. The scale was different. The stakes were different. But the choice was the same. See injustice and speak, or see injustice and stay silent. You chose to speak. That makes you part of the story now." Emma looks at the photograph with new eyes. She understands now why her father keeps it hidden. Not because he is ashamed, but because it is too powerful to treat casually. This photograph is not decoration. It is instruction. It is a reminder of who they are supposed to be, what they are supposed to do when tested, how they are supposed to live. That night, Emma writes in her journal, "I always thought the story of Tommy Morrison was about something that happened a long time ago to someone I never met. But today I realized it is about now. It is about me. It is about every choice I make when I see something wrong and have to decide whether to look away or stand up. Grandpa Tommy is not just history. He is a challenge. Every day I have to ask myself, am I living up to what he did? Am I being brave enough? Am I caring enough about strangers?" She does not know it yet, but Emma will carry this question with her for the rest of her life. She will become a civil rights attorney. She will represent victims of police brutality, immigrants facing deportation, workers fired for organizing unions. She will spend 40 years fighting battles that feel impossible, representing clients who have no money and no power against systems designed to crush them. And every time she feels like giving up, every time the odds feel insurmountable, she will think about a 12-year-old newsboy standing on a wooden crate, his voice shaking but determined, shouting truth to a crowd that wanted to believe lies. Michael watches his daughter grow into someone who carries Tommy's legacy forward, and he understands that this is how courage survives across generations. Not through monuments or museums, through families who tell stories and children who listen, and moments when those children realize the stories are about them, that they are being called to carry forward something precious and difficult and absolutely necessary. In 2019, Michael is diagnosed with cancer. He has 6 months to live, maybe less. He calls Emma home. She flies in from Washington, D.C., where she has been arguing a case about factory workers exposed to toxic chemicals without proper safety equipment. The parallels to Tommy's story are not lost on either of them. Michael is in his study, the photograph spread out on his desk along with other family documents. Tommy's court testimony from 1936, Heinrich's Department of Labor reports, Mary's medical school diploma, letters James Morrison wrote to his brother before he died. Michael says, "I need you to understand something before I go. This photograph is not an heirloom. It is a responsibility. Keeping it means remembering what it represents. It means living in a way that honors what Tommy did. It means passing it to your children with the same understanding I am passing to you. That we come from people who chose right over easy, and we have an obligation to do the same." Emma holds the photograph carefully. She is 41 years old now, the same age Tommy was when he told his own children this story for the first time. She says, "I have been thinking about something." The photograph shows the moment before Tommy shouted the truth, not the moment after, not the consequence. Just the decision point. Why do you think Heinrich captured it that way? Michael smiles. It is a question he has thought about many times. He says, "Because the moment of decision is the only moment that matters. What happened after, the arrests and the trial and the reforms, those were important. But they were not the point. The point is that instant when Tommy chose, when he could have gone either way, when the outcome was uncertain, but the choice was clear. Heinrich captured that moment because he understood that courage is not about succeeding. It is about deciding. Tommy did not know if telling the truth would save those women. He did not know if he would survive the next hour. He only knew what was right. And he did it. That is the lesson. Not that good always wins, but that good is always worth fighting for, even when winning is not guaranteed. Emma nods. She gets it now in a way she never did before. The photograph is not a victory photo. It is a decision photo. And that makes it both more honest and more powerful. Because most of us will never know if our choices lead to happy endings. We just have to make them and trust that doing right matters even when we cannot see the results. Michael dies 3 weeks later. At his funeral, Emma tells the story of Tommy Morrison to a church full of people who have never heard it. She explains how her great-great-grandfather, at age 12, made a choice that saved 200 lives and changed labor law in America. She talks about how that choice echoed forward through 4 generations, shaping how her family understands courage and responsibility and love. And she makes a promise that she will pass the photograph to her own children someday, and she will tell them the same story, and she will challenge them to live up to it. After the funeral, Emma takes the photograph home to Washington, D.C. She keeps it in her desk drawer, just like her father did, wrapped in the same handkerchief, next to the same pencil. And sometimes, late at night when she is preparing for a difficult case, she takes it out and looks at Tommy's face. That 12-year-old boy who had no idea he was about to become a legend, who just knew that people needed help and he was the only one who could provide it. Emma whispers to the photograph, "I hope I make you proud. I hope I am brave enough. I hope when my moment comes, I choose the way you did." And in some way that cannot be measured or proven, Tommy Morrison answers, not in words, but in the strength Emma feels when she walks into court the next morning. In the clarity she has when facing down corporations who value profit over human life. In the certainty that telling the truth, even when it costs everything, is the only way to live with yourself. That is the final truth of the photograph. It is not about what happened on October 13th, 1935. It is about what happens every day when someone remembers that moment and decides to be brave. It is about the unbroken chain of courage that connects a newsboy in Chicago to a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C. It is about the way love transcends time, the way sacrifice echoes forward, the way one child's decision becomes a family's identity, and a reminder to everyone who hears the story that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The photograph will stay in that desk drawer for another generation. Emma will pass it to her daughter someday, and that girl will pass it to her children. And the story will continue, changing slightly with each telling but always carrying the same essential truth. That courage is choosing to act when action is dangerous. That love is caring about strangers enough to risk yourself for them. That truth is the only foundation worth building a life on, and that each of us, no matter how young or powerless we feel, has the capacity to change the world if we are willing to pay the price. Tommy Morrison was 12 years old when he stood on that wooden crate and shouted truth to a crowd that wanted lies. He was terrified. His hands shook. His voice cracked. But he did it anyway. And 85 years later, his great-great-great-granddaughter will face her own impossible choice, and she will remember his photograph, and she will find the courage to do what needs to be done because she comes from people who understood that some things matter more than safety. That is the legacy. That is the lesson. That is why the photograph stays in the family instead of in a museum. Because some truths are too important to be displayed behind glass. They need to be lived. They need to be touched. They need to be passed from hand to hand generation to generation, each person feeling the weight of what Tommy Morrison did and understanding that they are being asked to carry forward something sacred. The photograph is not history. It is a living challenge. A question asked across time: when your moment comes, who will you choose to be? Will you be the person who looks away? Or will you be the person who stands up? Will you choose comfort over courage? Or will you choose love over fear? Tommy Morrison answered that question in 1935. And his answer lives on in everyone who knows his story, everyone who sees his photograph, everyone who faces injustice and remembers that a 12-year-old newsboy once risked everything for strangers, because that is what love looks like when tested. The photograph stays in the drawer, safe, protected, waiting for the next person who needs to remember that courage is possible, that ordinary people can be heroes, that the choices we make matter far beyond what we can see or measure or understand. And Tommy Morrison, frozen forever at age 12 in black and white, continues to teach us the most important lesson any of us will ever learn: that the only thing required for evil to triumph is for good people to stay silent. And the only thing required for good to triumph is for one person to be brave enough to speak. That person was Tommy Morrison on October 13th, 1935. That person can be any of us, any day we choose. That is the story behind the photograph. That is the truth worth remembering. That is the legacy worth protecting. And that is why it matters. The closing lesson: truth often demands a price, and courage is not a grand trait we're born with, but a quiet habit practiced in terrifying seconds. This story shows that choosing other people over your own safety can be the single act that reshapes generations. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by real historical facts and is meant to move us, not to sensationalize. Think for a moment. When have you chosen truth, even when it cost you dearly? Which family's secret or loyalty shaped the person you became? What would you risk today to stop harm to strangers? If you stayed until the end, write the word truth seed in the comments so I know you watched. And tell me which city you're watching from. If you feel comfortable, share an old story from your family about courage or a secret that changed a life. Your memories might inspire future episodes and we read them with care. Thank you for listening. If this moved you, please subscribe, like the video, turn on the bell, leave a comment, or share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And click the end card to watch the next chapter.